All right, so we're all back. Let's just have a quick discussion about what you guys talked about in your breakout rooms. Who wants to share? Go ahead.
I guess I'll share. So, in our breakout room, we were talking about how the author mentions like the contrast between Western culture and Eastern culture, and one sort of parallel that we drew was the feeling of like, for example, biracial people. They feel like they're kind of torn between each side of the family, and how they have like two different types of culture, right? But it's like to one community, it's like they don't completely fit in, but to the other community, they also don't completely fit in, so they're like torn, right? That was what we said.
Add to your point.
Yeah, go ahead, Mac.
Well, I would say that's very true. And the difference between Western and Eastern culture, I feel like more in the West, where the way things turned out to be, where we had all these different people from coming from Europe and Asia, all these different parts of the world coming over to here. There's more, I guess, mix and sort of kind of randomness. So I see, like, even though there is, I guess, kind of a duality of your two cultures, it's kind of like everyone here is the experience of all cultures here where we're at, while more in the East, people tend to stay with like, I feel like it'd be more rare to see that because people stay with their own people. Like if you're from a certain town in Europe, you're more likely to find someone in that town. So there's not much as I guess that duality of that split like culture, I guess. Because even like, whatever culture you're from, it's probably what you're gonna grow up with. Whether you're even if you have someone that's like black living in like the UK or something like that, they also grew up in the UK. So I mean, it's like confusing, but not at the same time, I guess.
Okay. Brianna?
Yeah, the greatest obstacle for the author was finding a good way to tell his story because like he was battling like insecurity and hesitation when it came to writing the book and stuff. So that's what I was saying.
Yeah, absolutely. You're spot on. And I think a lot of that insecurity and unsureness is the translation, right? Because there's things that happen in the world of the Dagara that English doesn't have a language for, right? And that also adds to that obstacle and that inability to produce the text. Yeah, good call out. What about the third point of inquiry? Who wants to share what they discuss as far as their attributes and their talents, providing them an avenue to fulfill their life's purpose or destiny? Or why do you think I asked that question? Either or is on the table. So Gisela, what did you discuss in your group about question three?
So about the purpose, right? And like our attributes. Well, like to what um for the question, you said that you we can say why you asked it.
Mm-hmm.
So to like act to like think about more like why we're here and like what we should do. We're not just like people like that like are supposed to work every day, 9 to 5s. Like we have another purpose. So for us to find like a deeper meaning.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're spot on. Does anybody else want to add to that, or actually discuss what they how they feel that their attributes will lead to their purpose? All right. So okay, let me provide my notes first, and then we'll jump into the fishbowl. And I know Jaden will put you down for a fishbowl. So this is the you guys read the introduction to this text. It's of water in the spirit, ritual magic, and initiation in the life of an African shaman. The author is Maladoma Patrice Somé, pictured here. He's from the West African area of what was now called Burkina Faso. Just real quick, I want to kind of how I was introduced into the book. Um, so when I was doing my undergrad, I was in a PAS class, and we had a guest speaker. That guest speaker happened to be the current chair of the Pan African Studies Department, Dr. Nana Lawson Bush. And he had us do this exercise in class where he divided the class up into two groups. One group was the red people, the other group was the blue people. And he assigned us the task of coming up with a system that will completely and totally suppress and subjugate the other group, right? So if you're in the red, you have to develop a system that will subjugate the blue. If you're in the blue, you're going to come up with a system that will subjugate the red. So me and once the activity was complete, in my hubris, I state, it sounds like what you're having us do is you're replicating the experience between Europeans and Africans and the Europeans' design of establishing this system of superiority. And for me to overcome that system, Black folks need to just go back to their Africanity, right? This is how I respond to the exercise. He's like, yeah, there's some truth to that, but I would respond with this, is what he says. As much as you think you know Africa, you have no idea of the profound depth of what goes on in Africa. There's things that happen in Africa that your mind wouldn't even understand if you tried to. If you've seen it, you wouldn't believe what you saw. And then he says, read this book and come talk to me after you read the book. So I read the book and he was absolutely correct. This shit, it blew my mind. Like there's things in the book that is beyond belief. It's beyond the way that we understand life to take place. It's beyond notions of things like gravity, right? And he makes a brief mention in the introduction. He talks about his grandfather's funeral ceremony, right? And he doesn't say this in what you guys read, but in that actual chapter that details the ceremony for his grandfather, the grandfather had made his transition. He's been what you guys may call dead for 3 days, right? The village elders come in, sage the place, spiritually clear the space that the grandfather is occupying, mix some medicines together in a pot. They're stirring the medicines together, walk away from the pot. The pot continues to stir on its own, right? And this is Mr. Maladoma accounting what he's witnessing. After they begin to stir themselves on their own, the pots go from the floor to the ceiling, right? So now the pots are actually above, continuing to stir themselves. One of the elders kind of prays around the grandfather, throws some dust on the grandfather. The grandfather raises from his deathbed, right? He's been dead for 3 days. They say a little prayer, beat some drums. The grandfather arises from his deathbed and he dances to his ceremonial burial grounds, which is like 2-3 miles away from his deathbed, right? So again, in our mind, right, what we perceive is when you're dead, you're dead. Your body's not going to be able to move or do any of these things that I just articulated to you. But these type of things are normal for the Dagara people within this text of Water in the Spirit. So he starts off by articulating his name, what his name means, right? To be friends with strangers or enemies. And he says that the Dagara people believe that every individual, everyone, comes into this life with a special destiny. A person's life project is therefore inscribed into the name he or she carries, right? So if you could think about your name, and if you could think about what your name means, within that meaning, within that definition of your name is you could find your life purpose, right? For those who don't know what their name means, right? That's why I offer you this notion of what are your gifts? What are your talents? What are your attributes, right? These are your God-given qualities that are going to allow you to fulfill your purpose. And then he states, the greatest obstacle I encountered writing this is that the things that I write about did not happen in English. They happen in a language that has a very different mindset about reality. And then he makes the claim, there is usually significant violence done to anything being transferred from one culture to another, right? So you cannot have any type of cultural exchange without some type of violence taking place, right? You cannot translate it happening from Spanish to English without some sort of violence taking place, okay? And then he talks about how he was kidnapped from the seminary, from his village, taken to the seminary school by the French Jesuits. And he says that, he was taught the white man's reality, right? History, geography, autonomy, mathematics, and literature. But then he goes on to say this: all of these topics were presented with a good dose of Christianity and its temperamental God, who forced everyone to live in constant fear of his wrath, right? So he's attentive to how God is being positioned by the French Jesuits. He's attentive to how the Christian God demands to be feared, right? Which is vastly different from his understanding of God and his indigenous native culture. And then another thing that I've realized that, which allowed me to make a connection between this reading and last week's, or actually 2 weeks ago reading, the Ptahhotep reading. He says, I know especially why my people have such deep respect for old age. And if you think about Ptahhotep's reading, he says, allow me to use my 110 years of wisdom to teach the people on how to engage in the Meter Nefer, good speech, right? So not only does age afford you wisdom, but for the Dagara people, elders and babies are the highest reverenced people in the community. Elders and babies are the closest to the ancestors. Why are babies and the elders the closest to the ancestor?
I got you. Well, for elders, I'll say you've lived life, you've had all those experiences, you've grown up. So in essence, you are about to become an ancestor. So that's why you are close to them. And for babies, you were just born, and just being born is the beginning of your journey. And ancestors are at the end of their journey. So I guess in a way, you're at the starting line, which is close to the finish line.
Yep, you're absolutely right, Mac. So babies, right? They come out of the womb is the direct demarcation between the ancestral realm while they was inside of the womb and then our reality, right? And to Mac's point, as you get older, you become closer and closer to becoming an ancestor, so you become closer and closer to that ancestral realm. Also, why this becomes generative, because of them being so close to the ancestors, the Dagara believe, and a lot of indigenous culture believe, that they have a direct line of communication with the ancestors, right? Because again, they're the closest to them. And then he goes on to say, and why a strong functioning community is essential for the maintenance of an individual's sense of identity, meaning, and purpose. So again, this notion of community becomes important, right? Thinking back to how we talked about Ma'at last week and how good consciousness is not just something that an individual says that I have a good conscience. It has to be understood by the community. And then I gave you the example of pre-colonial West Africa, to where manhood is not an individually owned identification or identity. It's a collective owned identity. And he says the same thing, right? The community is essential for the maintenance of the individual's sense of identity, meaning, and purpose. So the community is designed and organized to help you to fulfill your purpose. On page 4, and I believe we mentioned like the tension, Rohan was saying the tension between the Western cultures and the Eastern cultures, or European cultures and African cultures, right? And he says, Malidoma is attentive to the fact that he's attentive to this tension, right? Because his purpose is to reconcile the tension between the two worlds, right? To befriend the enemy. And he says that it seems obvious to me that as soon as one culture begins talking about preservation, it means that it has already turned the other culture into an endangered species, right? So because of this tension, right? And he's saying like, yo, we were peeping how when the Europeans came over here, they decimated and destroyed our land, our culture, our lifeways, right? But now their conversation's kind of changing to where they're talking about preserving indigenous cultures. But what Malidoma is saying though, once you start hearing the dominant culture talk about preservation, that other culture has to already know that they've lost. They lost the battle for preserving their own personal culture, right? Because European versions of cultural preservation looks like, I'm going to take your artifacts, I'm going to take your resources, right? And I'll store them in my museum. We'll store them in my banks because we know how to manage them and take care of them better, right? This is how we'll preserve your culture, by not letting you have it, or not letting the future generation of your culture know about these ancient artifacts that we possess in our museums, right? So at that point, that culture that's being preserved is already an endangered species, according to Maladona. And on page 7, he makes a very interesting claim. And I'm going to read it, and I'll kind of unpack why I disagree with this claim. And I think this is two-part. This could be helpful in two parts, right? One, you don't have to agree with everything you read, right? As critical thinkers, you should always be questioning what you're reading to see, is this true? Does it resonate with my spirit, right? Can I cross-reference this information, right? But he says, here in the West, I have a great deal of time for spiritual contemplation and study, and much more time to share things of the spirit with others. If I were still living in my village in Africa, nearly every spare moment would be taken up with scratching a living from the exhausted soil that is all colonialism has left us with, right? So he's attentive to the fact that, one, if I was in Africa, right, my free time would be spent working on the soil that colonialism eradicated and utilized till it's nothing left. But here in the West, in the Americas, right, I have time to spiritually contemplate and engage in dialogue with others around matters of the spirit. Now I ask y'all, how many of you guys have time for spiritual contemplation? If you do, raise your hand. And if you wanted to do some spiritual contemplation, do you have time to do that? Fuck no. You do? Gusel, you have time for spiritual contemplation? Well, take that time and do that. But I think for the most of us, your life is really not organized to do that. You have school, you have work, you have family things, right? You have really no free time. And then when you do have free time, the majority of us will watch TV, will hop on social media, things of that nature. Spiritual contemplation is not high up on that priority list, right? But he's saying he can do that because he lives in the West. And I would argue he can do that because of his occupation. He's an educator, right? So his job is to write books, to read books, to contemplate intellectually. But then he's also a spiritual guide, and he gets paid to do spiritual tours, right? So his occupation allows him the ability and the privilege to do spiritual contemplation, not the fact that he's in the West. So for me, that's something that I disagreed with. And upon further contemplation, I can see that it's really not about him being in the West, but more so what he does for a living, okay? And then he lays out very explicitly his thesis on page 8. And he says, what I'm attempting to share with you in this book is only one of the endless versions of reality, right? So he argues that there's multiple versions and multiple understandings of what reality is. And language is one conduit to give you an understanding of reality, right? English provides a certain understanding of reality. Spanish will provide another understanding of reality. Igbo would provide an understanding of reality, right? Every language has its own reality that it speaks to. And then he says on page 8, there's no words or concept in the Gara society for the supernatural. The close connection between thought and reality. To imagine something, there is a close connection between thought and reality. To imagine something, to closely focus one's thoughts upon it, has the potential to bring that something into being, right? So what you think and what you focus on will dictate what you experience in your life. And he says, a lot of people understand that to be magic, right? He says within his society, that's just the normal, natural law. That's the way that the world functions. And then on page 9, he goes in to talk about how he brought Star Trek to his community, right? And that the elders within his community didn't view things that we view as technologically advanced or futuristic. They viewed that as normal, right? So, like the alien character Spock, they identified him with other supernatural forces that are within their community. So they didn't see any of that as futuristic or beyond the reality, right? And then he makes the claim that the irony that the West sees indigenous world as primitive or archaic. So he says that's irony that the Western world views these indigenous world as primitive, right? But wouldn't it be wonderful if the West could learn to be as primitive or as archaic as my elders are, right? Because he says what the West views as their potential future in things like Star Trek, right? It's his society's current reality. So who's really primitive? Who's really more advanced? And then he makes a critique against the West, right? Because he says, you know, my elders are noticing how these European folks are coming in here and decimating our culture and decimating our land. It has to be something wrong with them, right? They either have tore up their land so bad that they have to come and get ours, or they have done something to offend their ancestors, which causes them to act this way. And he says, it is my belief that the present state of restlessness that traps the modern individual has its roots in a dysfunctional relationship with the ancestors, right? It's because you cannot successfully relate to your ancestors. You personally are in a state of restlessness. Your spirit cannot find peace, right? Because you don't know how to relate to those who came before you. And if you think about a lot of indigenous cultures, the ancestors take a precedent, right? He gives you the example of, I believe, either a Chinese society where when someone came into office, they had to go sit in the temple with their ancestors. I can think about from indigenous culture, from indigenous to this land, the movie Coco, right? The Disney movie. That's all about bringing homage to your ancestors, right? Making sure that your ancestors and those who came before you remain on their altar, right? From an African spiritual standpoint, right? It's all about the belief in the connection to your ancestors. You build an altar and a shrine to your ancestors and make sure there's food at that altar. Make sure that shrine remains clean because you want to honor your ancestors, right? And I'll end with this. Another claim that Maladoma makes. This one I do agree with, and I'll read it. But before I do, quick question. Someone define for me, what is alienation? What does alienation mean? Or to be alienated, what does that mean?
Got you.
Isolated.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Isolated? Go ahead, Matt. What are you going to say?
To be separated from others, to be like isolated, to be purposely left out, to be pushed out, to be expelled, to be excluded.
Yep. To be alien, right? An outsider, absolutely. To be an outsider, to be an alien, right? So this is his claim. Alienation is one of the many faces of modernity. So when you hear this term modernity, there's two ways to really think about it. One is just the modern, right? Our contemporary reality that we currently exist in, that can be understood as modernity. Also, from historical epic standpoint, right? Modernity could be understood as the point to when the Europeans became world powers, right? So when all Eastern world was successfully conquered by the West is the start of modernity, okay? So he says, alienation is one of the many faces of modernity. The cure is communication and community. A new sense of togetherness. By opening to each other, we diminish the pressure of being alone and exiled. I have told my story here with the wish that it will be a help to those who pick it up, with a sense of hope, searching for answers of their own. So, when he lays out the problem, right? This modern world that we exist in, it promotes alienation. So, to counteract that, we must relate to one another. We must develop a new sense of togetherness, right? And for me, this is the line that we can draw between the teaching of Ptahhotep, the Ma'at reading that we did, and this text here. This notion of relation. How do we relate to one another? This is all that each 3 reading is really talking about, right? So I'll end my notes there. I know Jaden wants to fishbowl, so we'll have him down for a fishbowl. Anybody else want to volunteer for fishbowl?
Yeah, I'll volunteer.
Okay, Rohan. Anyone else? Let's get 1 more, 2 more at most.
I'll volunteer.
Okay.
Me too.
Andy and Brianna. All right, so I'll put myself on mute, and you guys can set it off.
Okay. I'll start. It says, white man must have destroyed his own land to had to come here and take the land of others. And I think this relates to the reality, because some people have known that Christopher, like Columbus, how he was like the first one to discover America, but it has been proven that there are already people on the land, like Native Americans. So in reality, like white people took it from them. So basically, this is what the quote is saying. And there's also another quote that I want to talk about. It says, the violence of inner cities with their problems of poverty, drugs, and crime, spiraling unemployment, and economic disarray, growing intolerance towards people of color, and the values of other cultures bring about self-destruction. And this relates to the reality of the world now, because there is still some issues that we're going through, like violence and like racial bias, you know? And so, yeah, it's things we're going through that is damaging to the country. So the author is basically right. Like, it's still going on no matter what. That's it.
Thank you, Brianna.
Yeah, Brianna, that's a good point. Because to be honest, like for me, and this kind of goes back to like that first point about like the author's like greatest difficulty. Because I mean, like for me, like looking at this, it felt more like a comparison between African culture and really just Western culture in general. And for me, like I could relate to it more so because it's like, I mean, like I was born in America, but like by blood I am Nigerian. So because of that, like when I'm reading something like this, and I'm kind of like reading like the ideas between like fact versus failure, or also looking at like the American side between inner cities and kind of just like seeing well ghettos. I mean, for crying out loud, my grandma lives on Crenshaw, so for me it's like it's interesting to see the parallels, and then at the same time kind of see like how he has kind of like insecurity or even like difficulty in that, because it's like how do you explain one towards the other? How do I explain fufu to my white friends, and then how do I explain Instagram to my grandparents? So it's yeah.
Good point, Jay.
Okay, I guess I'll go now. I actually wanted to talk about that thing you said about language and how that kind of like alters your view of reality. So, I'm someone who likes to study language, right? And also like, like anthropology, like evolution type stuff. And I found that it's interesting how like depending on what language you speak, it seems like you don't just have a different view of reality, but also like it might change the way you think. And I think some people, the way that they think, it's more flexible than other people. Like people who grow up in multilingual countries, right? Like Southeast Asia, right? Or like the Netherlands, right? They grow up speaking, 2, 3 languages. And I think it's really interesting that like this author who comes from some part of Africa and then went to the US, right? So they obviously picked up both languages. It's interesting that they're able to kind of critique America from that different perspective. And I think it probably has to do with like the altered way that they view the world and the altered way that their sort of brain like processes things, just based on the culture that sort of brought them up. Yeah, those are my thoughts.
It's a really good point. And actually, Rohan, as we get into next week's reading, we're going to really unpack this kind of conversation around language. So Good points. Andy, it's on you, bro.
Well, I wanted to talk about one of the lines that he says in the reading. He talks about how people need to understand that there's many realities, not just one. He talked about how his tribe does not distinguish reality and imagination. That goes to like the experiment that he did about the Star Trek. Like he says that his elders like thought it was, I guess, normal in a way, and how he compared it to like the Western people, how they sees it as like the future, but the elders thought it was like how it is now. They didn't really distinguish it was like, I guess, fiction. Um, so yeah, I thought that was really interesting. I thought it was true how there are many realities. It's all like perspective in a way.
Yeah. Thank you guys. That was a really good fishbowl. You guys brought up really good points that we can kind of engage in overall class conversation. Um, what did you guys think about the Talesman and his musings on the Talesman's ability to get him through college, to get him to really to navigate the rest of his life? So his ability to use the science and the magic that his ancestors provided him to navigate the Western world. What were your thoughts on that?
Wait, Professor, can you repeat that? I'm sorry, I'm having.
So he mentions that he received a talisman, right? This little bag with these magical items in it, and how that talisman would give him some type of intuition as he went to college, right? He said he would be able to read the answers of the exams on the professors' faces as they walked the aisles, and he believed that it was his traditional spiritual magic that allowed him to have that understanding. To allow him to even obtain a scholarship, that was the talisman doing its work. So, what do you guys think about his articulation of traditional African magic, allowing him to navigate the Western world?
Uh, I think, I mean, personally for me, I think it's like a I think it's like a grounding method almost. Like it's his way of staying close to his culture in terms of navigating the ways of like the Western world. It's kind of like I'd say Dorothy's slippers when she went to Oz in a sense. You know, there's no place like home. You kind of there's certain things that you kind of have to take with you when you journey into like I guess what's considered a new land. So I figured like I mean sometimes I don't know like for me I still have my dashiki so every now and then I got to put that on rep it but it's like you have to keep something close to you because it's hard
Right.
to just, like go into like a new place and then kind of have like no like real representation or no real kind of like physical connection back to what you treasure as your culture.
Yeah, and I think grounding is a very interesting choice of words. I love it. There's a couple of ways to think about this, right? So one, it keeps you grounded. Okay, it keeps you centered into who you are. And then from like a scientific standpoint, right? So I used to work for Apple before I started lecturing, and I used to do repairs. And so before you start to do the repairs, you had to get like a little thing to keep you grounded, right? And the reason that they would do that is if you opened up a certain thing and you're not grounded, you have the potential to electrocute yourself, right? So it can become very dangerous when you're not grounded. So if you are to take that and apply it to Jaden's articulations, right? When you're traveling in a foreign land or you're traveling from one world to another and you don't have that grounding, that allows you to get electrocuted. It allows you to get electrocuted, right? So that grounding becomes important to not only one, to allow you to remain who you are, but it also will help you avoid harm, right? And if you think about how he talks about his talisman, not only did it allow him to avoid harm, it gave him guidance and intuition when he needed it. You know what I mean? So I think that's a great way of thinking about it. And I also kind of relate what you're saying, Jaden, to him saying how when he travels out west for a certain amount of time, he needs to come home to get a cleanse, right? To kind of get that, to wash the West off of him and get him back grounded to his indigenous lifestyle. Yeah, that's a really good point. Any other thoughts, comments, concerns about the reading? Let's talk about this notion of living within two worlds, right? Another way to think about this is what W.E.B. Du Bois calls double consciousness, or to live the life of a double life, a dual life, right? And there's multiple ways that we could think about this double life. It could be from a standpoint of language, being bilingual, right? So you have one reality based off your language. It could be a cultural reality. We mentioned having multiracial, right? So that places you within two worlds. But then it's something also that, especially in the Western world, especially for those who are African descended people, right? It's the two worlds of blackness and then the alternate world of whiteness. And the tensions that come at play when those two worlds are often unreconciled, right? And you see these tensions come up in several ways. And one of these ways is code switching. Who does not know what code switching is? Who does not know what code switching is? So everybody understands code switching when I say that, right? So since no. Okay. So code switching. Code switching could look like a variety of things, right? So if my native language is Spanish, right, and we always speak Spanish with my peers, but you go into a certain restaurant, you go into a certain grocery store, and you know not to speak Spanish because you're afraid of what may happen. So you code switch to speak English, right? Code switching could be on the block with your homeboys. You have a certain vocabulary, you have a certain way of expressing yourself, you have a certain way of relating to one another. But then when it's come time to go to work, you're starting to kind of sound like this. And yes, I'm here to help you, and this is my professional voice, right? Code switching, right? Does that help you understand what I mean when I say code switching, Jaden?
Yeah, all right. I never knew there was like an official term for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Emiliano. You're exactly right, Emiliano. So, and that's one of the examples that I give, right? So at home, you speak Spanish, but then when you go to school, you leave that Spanish at home and you speak English, right? So not only is it code switching, but it's also cultural violence. Why do I say it's cultural violence? Why is code switching an act of cultural violence?
Maybe because you're failing to intertwine the two cultures.
Yeah.
It's the alienation of one side of a culture.
Yep. And then Emiliano says you're neglecting your indigenous culture. And then also, I think another way to paraphrase the neglecting is you're placing priority on the other culture that's not yours, right? So I'm going to talk like a white person because that's professional, right? So to talk like quote unquote a black person is unprofessional, right? So this is where this notion of code switching comes in. And we often do this for one, means of survival, right? Just to keep it plain and simple, it's a means of survival. And two, it's because of a social conditioning, right? Because you've been trained to understand that your indigenous, your native culture is not on the same level of value than the opposing culture, right? For my Spanish speakers, and Emiliano, I believe, gave the example of speaking Spanish at home and not at school. Do you know how historical that act is? So for those who grew up in California, right, you had to do, I think it's like fourth grade, you do your mission project. Does everybody remember having to do like a mission project? You build a mission and you go to visit a mission. Did y'all, I don't know if they still, I'm old, so I don't know if they still do that shit.
I remember that, yeah.
Okay.
We did
All
that.
Bet. So especially for my folks who are indigenous, right? If you consider yourself South American, Mexican, whatever the case may be, right? If you're indigenous to this land, that is the equivalent of having black folks do a project where they go and build a plantation. They go and visit a plantation. It's the same exact thing. Do you know the level of cultural violence that went into those missionary schools? Every time that you spoke your native language, you were viciously beaten for speaking that language, right? Even to the way that your hair was cut. If it was cut in a way that was native, you would be beaten for that, right? So when Emiliano brings up this example of speaking Spanish at home but not in school, that has great historical context. He's literally speaking to the experience of his ancestors, to where, and in their own communal setting, they had a certain language, but because of the violence that was inflicted upon them in the schooling process, they could not use that language, right? So you do things like code switch to survive. And then you're beat into submission to where you no longer value your native language, right? So this is this notion of code switching. And this is why this idea of code switching is literally an act of cultural violence, right? So let me ask y'all, what would the world be, what would society be if we didn't code switch? What would that produce?
And this is if like current society, like not like a perfect utopia, kind of like just if everybody were to just be themselves now.
Yeah, right now.
Oh yeah, that's chaos.
You think so?
Yeah, to a large degree. I think because like in Western culture, especially, and especially like in America too, there's a very big emphasis, not necessarily on patriotism, but more so it's evolved to a level of nationalism. And I think because of that, especially in our own culture, like, and sometimes this happens overseas too. I mean, like, I'm not very familiar, but I know that for certain, there's a big emphasis on speaking English. So because of that, like, and that's just as an example. So because of that, I know that per se, like, if everybody, at least in our own country, kind of said, you know what, I'm just going to speak the way I want to, how I want to, regardless of how everybody feels, regardless of social standards or and I say that with air quotes, or like norms. I feel like it would cause disarray in the sense that like nobody wants to follow a set rule that has been made by the white man to a degree. And because of that, it would cause like because like it's when you make the system's rules, it's easy to enforce. So I think it's just going to be it's just going to cause a lot of chaos to, I don't know, have people, especially like higher ups that are considered themselves professional, to kind of, you know, like, and I say this with air quotes too, but kind of get back everybody in line to a degree. So yeah.
So I would ask then, Jaden, because I agree with you, and then I disagree. I agree with you in the sense that it would disrupt the order of things, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I kind of feel that, not I don't kind of feel, I very much feel that the current order of things needs to be disrupted. I'm looking at the comments, and Emiliano is saying it's going to lead to a more diversity of cultures, right? Like the world and the society would be more diverse. Emiliano, do you want to elaborate on that? All right, so and here's why I asked this question, right? As much as possible, I try not to code switch. That's why the way I talk to y'all in class is exactly how I talk on the street, exactly how I talk to the barber in the barbershop. When I'm a student in my PhD programs, I speak the very same way, right? And what I find is one of two things. For those in the space that are from the dominant culture, and if you read in between the lines, you know what I'm talking about. From those in the space are from the dominant culture, they get extremely uncomfortable, right? But for those in the space that are not from the dominant culture, there's a level of comfort that kind of exudes the room, right? Also, I find, because I've been fortunate enough in my PhD program to have Black professors, right? And I'll be very attentive to the way that they phrase things and the way that they articulate things before I say anything, right? And by the time I get done saying what I have to say, or halfway through the semester, I find that their level of comfort and their ability to be themselves increases a lot more, right? So, yes, it disturbs the current social order, right? But again, I feel that it should be disturbed, right? Who's to say that talking professional is the right way to talk, right? Who's to say that the ability to go between Spanish and English is a bad thing? Is a liability more than is more of a liability than an asset, right? To me, if you can speak in multiple languages, that just proves your level of intelligence. You have a higher level of intelligence. You can think about things in two different ways. You have access to multiple realities, right? But because of our patriotism, because of our nationalism, because of our identifying with Eurocentric thought, we've been trained to think that because someone speaks Spanish or someone's bilingual, they're less intelligent. What fucking sense does that make? That don't make sense. How is somebody that can speak one language smarter than somebody who speaks multiple languages? But this is what we believe, right? We have whole classes set up to get somebody who speaks multiple languages to understand one language, right? So is it really a bad thing?
I mean, okay. For me, I'm saying, like, it definitely isn't a bad thing. For me, looking at it, I think that, and I agree with you, like, it is a very much so needed thing. And like, and I don't know, I'm thinking like maybe you're braver than me because like I've never been able to like kind of switch back, well, not necessarily switch back and forth, but more so have like a universal type of way that I do talk, because I've noticed that, like, you know, and I agree with you. It's like, it makes, sometimes when I talk a certain way, it makes certain people around me feel uncomfortable. And because of that, it's always been like a situation where, I mean, because, I mean, like, I grew up as a kid that was like from the air quotes hood, and then moved to like a more successful, whiter neighborhood.
Jaden, where'd you grow up?
Well, I spent my early years in Inglewood with my mom, but because of my parents' divorce, I ended up moving with my dad, and he lived in South Pasadena.
Okay.
So yeah,
that's hella different, bro. Inglewood and South Pass that's two different worlds for sure.
Oh yeah. So for me, it was like I noticed that because of the certain like slang, because of the way that I talked, like it not only like created a different environment in terms of making people uncomfortable, but it gave people preconceived notions of me before I was able, they actually learned who I was. Mm-hmm. So for me, like, I've never had like, I don't know, like maybe the sense to say like, you know what, maybe I should like put this all in something universal. That way, like, I guess everybody can understand me. But it's always been like a thing where it's like, I know that, okay, well, I'm like around more of my white friends now. I need to start talking in this specific manner. Or, oh, you know, I'm with more of my Black friends now. I mean, I'm like free. I don't have weights on me. But I definitely like for me, I think that in a lot of ways, like the current system that we have is definitely something that is wrong. It's definitely something that needs to be changed. And I don't think that it is a bad thing to be able to have people like fully express themselves the way that they should. I mean, I want to, but at the same time, for me, I'm also thinking, because like if something like that would have happened overnight, I can't help but wonder like what the first maybe few months or year would be of kind of like this disarray in the system before we actually get to a place where everybody's kind of like accepted. Yeah. Like Selma didn't happen in a night. So for me, it's like I can't see this happening in a night either.
Yeah, and it won't. It'll be a evolving thing. But for me, because of one group of people's need to be comfortable, the whole rest of the world is suffering. Because of one group of people's need to be comfortable, the whole world is suffering, right? And when I hear you say, you feel the weight come off when you're around your Black friends, again, that's an act of violence. You know what I mean? Your spirit is being assaulted because you can't be your full self to the point that you physically feel a weight on you, right? So what would it feel like to have that weight lifted off you all the time. And Jaden, bro, believe you me, I feel you because I had the same social experience, right? Not Inglewood, but I grew up in Pomona and I moved to Rancho, right? So that dichotomy is just the same. And I think for me, because I seen the people who would code switch and want to make everyone comfortable, and I just that wasn't me, right? And I've always, even as a kid, I never gave a fuck what other people thought about me, right? So that also allows me to feel more comfortable not code switching. You're just gonna deal with me as I am, right? But there's something to be said about living your full authentic self, right? But here's another thing. Because of socialization, because of patriotism, because of nationalism, a lot of us don't even know who our true self is. You think this professional puppeteered motherfucker that's been engineered is your true self, right? And to me, that's even more of a travesty. I'm curious to hear from my bilingual individuals how this plays out, how this notion of code switching plays out for you.
I guess I can share on that. Coming from Singapore, you know, I mean, we do speak English, but it's like a completely different version of English. You know, if I were to speak in like Singaporean dialect, I think most people just wouldn't understand me, which is why I tend to lean more towards this like American English. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and it's like I don't know that it's necessarily like constricting me in any way. It's just like it's like what I talked about earlier, like, you know, being able to speak different kinds of languages. Because even if it's still English at the end of the day, I mean, it feels like a completely different language, right? So I don't think that it's so much constricting me, but it's just allowing me to develop that, you know, as I said, flexibility in the way that I like see things, in the way that I can articulate what I'm thinking and how I'm feeling. Yeah.
It's a good point. So I have two assignments for you as we close out class today. One is more grounded in this idea of your purpose and your destiny, and thinking about those talents and attributes. I need you guys to really spend some time in spiritual contemplation and thinking about what your purpose is, right? And you may not get to answer that question of purpose. And if you don't get that, that's okay. But start thinking about the qualities that you possess that are beneficial, and think about how those qualities can help push you closer to your purpose, right? Spend some time. I don't know what your practice is, whether it's journaling, whether it's writing things down. This is why I had us meditate today, to give you an avenue to go through this practice of spiritual contemplation. But spend some time and really put some energy into this idea of what your purpose and what your destiny is. For those who feel like they have an idea of what their purpose or what their destiny is, your task then becomes to do all in your power to fulfill that destiny, to fulfill that purpose. Think back to the teaching of Ptah, follow your heart, right, for all of your life. So this kind of goes back to that meditation, right? So if you have your purpose, start putting plans in action on how to fulfill that purpose. If you don't have that purpose, spend some time on thinking about what that purpose can be, basing this idea on what are your talents, what are your skills, what are your abilities, right? Just as the Dagara assigns you names to help you fulfill your purpose and to constantly remind you of your purpose, the Creator, the Most High, God, Allah, whatever you call that individual, that being, has provided you attributes, skill sets, right? That's going to allow you to manifest that purpose. This is why I tell you guys, I don't care about your grades. This is not what I'm here for, to give you an A, a B, a C. That's not what my objective is. My objective is to help you to realize your purpose. My objective is to help you look at the world from a different capacity. I'm living my purpose. I spent my time meditating. I spent my time contemplating, right? I thought about my skills, my gifts, and my talents to uncover my purpose. And my purpose has placed me before y'all. And me fulfilling my purpose is allow this conversation that we're having in this very moment to manifest itself. So again, my job is not about your grades. It's about tapping into your spirit, making your spirit move in a way that's going to make this earth a better place. This is what we're all here for. An African principle is to leave something better than how you found it, right? So we're all here on earth to do our part in our sphere of influence to leave the world better than what we found it. Y'all may not have children yet, but for those who do have children, you have to leave a better world for your children than what you inherited. And your purpose will allow you to do so. Your purpose will open doors for you that you haven't even thought about walking in yet. Your purpose will put your name in the mouths of people that will carry your name across the world, and you haven't even stepped foot on these places yet. This is what we are here for. This is what education in the African sense is designed to do. That schooling is concerned with your grades and concerned with getting a good job and all that distracting bullshit that this world has trained us to believe is important. But again, if we are truly spiritual beings having a human experience, we have to fulfill our spiritual purpose. This is why we're here. So that becomes your homework. Second part of your homework, and Jay, this is going to you. In times where you normally would code switch, so if you normally wouldn't speak Spanish in this store, speak Spanish. If you normally would put on your professional voice in front of certain friends, don't do that. See what happens. Now, I'll give you this advisory. Be safe. Don't fuck around and lose your job. Don't get your ass whooped. Be safe in the way that you go about pushing the borders of this code switching. But I want you to push these borders. And we'll come back next week and we'll talk about it. But again, your task is to is not to code switch in times where you normally would code switch. And then be attentive to how those around you respond, but be more attentive to how you feel. And if you feel a weight coming off of you, then you know you've gotten closer to your true self. And that's where you should be all the time. And that's going to be your homework. We'll discuss that for next week. I wanted to show you guys where your reading is for next week, and then we'll call it a day. Give me one moment. But if you do have any questions or concerns, feel free to comment while I pull up our Google Classroom site. Yeah, it's not easy. It's going to be uncomfortable for a little bit. But again, certain people have been comfortable for too long, and we need to start disrupting that. So for next week, we're going to read Ngugi, Decolonizing the Mind. The Politics of Language is the subtitle of the text. So this kind of goes back to a lot of what Rohan was speaking about today. So I think this will be very generative for you, Rohan. But again, Ngugi, Decolonizing the Mind, I will email that out to everyone by Thursday or Friday. But if you want to get started now, that's where the text is. Is there any other... No, you don't have to write it down, Brianna. We're just going to talk about it in class for a little bit. It'll just be a conversation, more of a social experiment. Any other questions, comments, or concerns before we call it a day? All right. I appreciate y'all. Be well. Get some water. Get some exercise. Get some vitamin D. Stay healthy. I'll see you next week. Peace. You're welcome.